Hello, this video is for May the 5th. Yesterday was May the 4th. Hope you celebrated Star Wars Day. Going to start off with what reminding you some of the things you need for the AP exam. So this AP exam day checklist, I know some of you are probably shrugging and saying, I know what to do. I don't need a checklist. It really is important. Not only do you need to write down your 8-character number so that you have it available, but if you read through the parts of the checklist, there's some important stuff in there. There's some silly stuff. Make sure your device is plugged in, but that's not all that silly. We don't want batteries dying in the middle of the test. Make sure it's plugged in so you're not relying on battery power. The browser you use, this is really important. You need to use Chrome, Firefox, Safari, or Edge. If you're using something else, change. Get your computer set up to use one of those 4 browsers: Chrome, Firefox, Safari, or Edge. Practice with the exam demo. If you type in, and I'm going to provide the link in an announcement to the AP exam demo, but you absolutely need to practice with that exam demo. If you'll be typing your exam, have a Google Doc or Microsoft Word, or have the proper kind of doc open and available, and it tells you that you prepared it in advance. You've typed your 8-character AP ID and your initials at the top of each document. Your initials only, not your name. It's crucial that you not type your name, just your initials at the top. First initial, last initial. Just 2 initials is all we need there. If you'll be handwriting, you've got paper set up, 2 sheets of paper, because the AP Econ exam is going to have 2 questions. Same thing with if you're typing, 2 Google Docs available or Word docs available. Again, write your 8-character AP ID at the top, your initials, and the page number at the top of each page. Reviewed the required materials for the specific exam. For AP macro and micro, you should have scrap paper available that you won't be turning in, but it'll help you think through the question and answer the questions. And a calculator is acceptable. You can use a calculator on the exam this year only. First time ever they've allowed that. And then the back side has a lot more here. I've been approved. If you've been approved for accommodations, you've reviewed that, the College Board website for accommodations, or language, and then it goes into a lot of other stuff here, and then during the exam. So I'll talk a little bit more about that the next time we have a video, the requirements during the exam. All right, this first part of the video today, right now, is going to be a review of the short run Phillips curve, and then we'll extend that to the long run Phillips curve. So remember that the short run Phillips curve, this downward sloping thing on a graph that's got inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal axis, implies that whenever we have high rates of inflation, we typically, historically, have very low rates of unemployment. And whenever we have high rates of unemployment, historically, we've had low rates of inflation. The reason for that is rooted back here in the ADAS graph, which you're very, very familiar with at this point: price level on the vertical axis and GDP on the horizontal axis. Long-run aggregate supply is at Y full employment, the output that is full employment output. Typically, what happens in an economy is that aggregate demand is shifting back and forth. So I'm going to go to a red pen now. What happens if aggregate demand shifts to the right? Well, we get inflation, but we get lower rates of unemployment. If natural rate of unemployment is, let's say, 5%, and we're operating beyond full employment, that means that we're operating at 4 or even 3% unemployment. So operating beyond full employment level means a low rate of inflation, low rate of unemployment, sorry. So that would be a position up here, okay? So this AD1 is going to be associated with this point right here. High rate of inflation, prices going up, low rates of unemployment. If AD shifts to the left, back this way to AD2, we would wind up with reduced inflation, in fact, maybe even deflation, okay? But we're going to say just reduced rate of inflation. And we would wind up with more unemployment. We'd be short of full employment. We'd be operating at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% unemployment. And that would be associated with low rate of inflation, high rate of unemployment with this point over here. So this AD2 shifting to the left, we slide down the Phillips curve. If AD shifts to the right, we move up the Phillips curve. All right, so that's just a review of what we talked about in class last week. Now, what we found over time is that when you took a look at the points on the Phillips curve on page 776, you see that they all kind of clump around to the right or to the left of something around 5 to 6% unemployment. And in fact, what I said at the end of the video for last week is that we've determined that there is something called the long run Phillips curve, LRPC, which is at the natural rate of unemployment. So that says NRU, natural rate of unemployment. Okay. And what happens is that the short run Phillips curve tends to shift to the left or to the right, but it doesn't shift to the left or the right based on AD. If AD is moving the Phillips curve, we just slide up and down the Phillips curve. So shifts in aggregate demand simply move us along a given short run Phillips curve. Okay. It's when AS shifts. So I'm going to stay with my blue pen here and talk about what happens if there is a supply shock. Remember that a supply shock is when suddenly we don't have enough inputs. Either there's been the plague has killed off 25% of the population and we don't have enough workers, or for some reason we're cut off from some of our raw materials, supplies, and the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. We'll call that SRA, short run aggregate supply 1. That's going to cause inflation and unemployment. Okay, we're going to get both. Higher price levels, okay, we're going to go from PL sub 0 to PL1. We're going to get inflation, but we're going to get unemployment. So if we get a high level of inflation and a high level of unemployment, we're going to wind up at a point out here somewhere. And that's not on the short run Phillips curve. What happened? We must have shifted the short run Phillips curve. We'll call that SRPC1, okay? And we're at a point over here where we've got everything kind of out of whack. People are going to adjust to higher rates of inflation, and we're going to get back eventually to this long-run Phillips curve at some point as this economy adjusts, and we wind up moving up here because let's say that the government, because of unemployment, the government has a stimulus package, so we wind up here. So eventually this will shift back up here, and we have a new higher rate of expected inflation. Now, here's something that you really need to make a note of. Wherever the short-run Phillips curve crosses the long-run Phillips curve, given that time era, so this was the previous short-run Phillips curve, if the economy had been operating at full employment and everything had been running smoothly, we would have been operating right there at the natural rate of unemployment. And this would have been our rate of inflation, okay? So INFL sub 0, we'll call it. When the AD shifted to the right, we moved up here, and we got actual rate of inflation was higher than the expected rate of inflation. When AD shifted to the left in a recession, we came down here, and the actual rate of inflation was lower than the expected rate of inflation. Okay, so this is the expected rate of inflation where it crosses over. and then adjustments are typically made, and we wind up hopefully getting back to the original place there. However, when short run aggregate supply shifted to the left here in the supply shock, we wound up moving out here off of the short run Phillips curve and then ultimately back here. And we wound up in a situation where the expected rate of inflation, FL inflation rate, expected rate of inflation, number one, is higher. People just got used to the higher rates of inflation. And we wound up back at full employment at that higher rate of inflation because that's what folks were used to. We just expected it to be 4, 5, 6% inflation instead of 3% inflation. Okay? All right. So a shift to the left of the short run aggregate supply typically results in a shift to the right of the short run Phillips curve. The opposite is also true. If we wind up with technology shifting the short run aggregate supply to the right, we move down from equilibrium. This is the initial equilibrium, but back when everything was in equilibrium, we moved to here, and we wound up with lowering inflation and but higher rates of unemployment. So lower rates of unemployment, excuse me. Okay, when we go out here, we have lower rates of unemployment, low inflation, low unemployment. We wind up down here somewhere. Okay, again, we shift away from the original short-run Phillips curve to a new short-run Phillips curve, SRPC2, associated with this point, and we may eventually wind up coming down here at a expected inflation rate that is significantly lower because the short-run Phillips curve has shifted to the left when the short-run aggregate supply shifted to the right. All right, so I'm going to wrap this video up at that point. That's showing that we always gravitate back to the long-run Phillips curve as we adjust back to full employment. Whenever the economy is operating at full employment, we're somewhere along this long-run Phillips curve. It just depends on whether the short run has shifted out to the right or the left. By the way, currently in the the early 2000s and the 2010s, the Phillips curve is somewhat to the left here. We're probably operating somewhere with it relatively far to the left. And we'll talk about more about this in the next video.